ceasefire announced. Hours ago, the most powerful military on the planet blinked. Not in secret, not through a back channel, in a public post on Truth Social under Donald Trump's own signature. The man who told the world that a whole civilization will die tonight crossed his own deadline, picked up Iran's negotiating document, endorsed it as a workable framework, and agreed to pause his promised obliteration for 2 weeks. Iran's Supreme National Security Council responded with an official statement calling it what it appeared to be a historic, undeniable, crushing defeat for the United States. 2 weeks ago, a senior American official told Axios that Iran's 10-point plan was maximalist and unclear if it will allow moving forward for a diplomatic solution. Hours ago, Donald Trump declared those same 10 points to be the foundation on which to build peace. The exact framework Washington called unworkable is now the official architecture of the negotiation. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what just happened, why Washington never saw it coming, and why the geopolitical map of the Middle East you are looking at today looks fundamentally different from the one you woke up in a week ago. Imagine you have a business partner. You threaten them for weeks with total destruction if they do not sign your contract. You announce a hard deadline. You put your pen on the table. And at the final hour, they slide their own contract across the desk instead. And you sign it. How long before every other partner watching that room decides your deadlines are theater? Hold that thought, because that is precisely what appears to have happened in the most consequential negotiation of 2026. Drop your answer in the comments. Was this Trump's strategic flexibility or the most visible miscalculation in modern American foreign policy? Let's rewind the clock. It started in the spring of 2025 when coordinated U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure set the region on fire. The Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's traded oil flows effectively went dark. A global energy crisis ignited almost overnight. Trump issued his terms through a 15-point framework, dismantled the nuclear program, constrained the missiles, reopened the strait, and the U.S. lifts sanctions. Iran looked at that framework and said, no, not renegotiate. No. For weeks, as Trump escalated his rhetoric to its most extreme register, Iran issued its own blueprint, a 10-point plan. It called for a formal commitment to non-aggression against Iran and its allies, continued Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, acceptance of uranium enrichment as an Iranian right, lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions, termination of UN Security Council and Board of Governors resolutions against Iran, full compensation for war damage, withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the region, and a permanent end to the war on all fronts, including Lebanon. Washington called the plan maximalist. Iran did not amend a single clause. Receipt number 1, the deadline that dissolved. Trump announced his 8 p.m. Eastern deadline with the language of biblical finality. The words were unmistakable. A whole civilization will die tonight. Less than 2 hours before that deadline expired, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Aim Munir made contact with the White House, and the obliteration was suspended. About the tree, Trump's own Truth Social statement made the mechanism explicit based on conversations with Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Amir of Pakistan, wherein they requested that I hold off the destructive force being sent tonight to Iran. The deadline, built with the vocabulary of total war, dissolved because a mediator asked politely. Washington was not setting the tempo. Washington was waiting for the phone to ring. Receipt number 2, the 10-point framework formally adopted. In the same statement, Trump wrote, we received a 10-point proposal from Iran and believe it is a workable basis on which to negotiate. Let that sentence sit for a moment. The identical framework that a senior U.S. official declared maximalist weeks earlier is now the official starting point for every conversation that follows. Trump added, almost all of the various points of past contention have been agreed to between the United States and Iran. White. Almost all of those 10 points, the same 10 points that included continued enrichment, Hormuz sovereignty, reparations, and forced withdrawal. Iran's Supreme National Security Council responded within hours with a formal government statement declaring that Iran has achieved a great victory and forced criminal America to accept its 10-point plan. That is not a social media post. That is an official document from Iran's highest security body. And Trump's own words do not contradict its core claim. Receipt number 3, the architecture of mediation. Iran's foreign minister formally declared that Tehran would cease defensive operations for 2 weeks and allow ships to transit the Strait of Hormuz via coordination with Iran's armed forces. Coordination, not open passage. Iran's military is now the operational authority over transit through one of the most critical waterways on Earth, with a $2 million per ship toll attached. Revenue that under Iran's framework goes toward reconstruction funding. According to multiple reports, China was described as very influential in shaping the off-ramp through Pakistani mediation, and Russia was involved in the broader diplomatic architecture. The two powers Washington has spent years attempting to contain were among the architects of the room where this framework took shape. Washington was not the first one in that room, and that absence was deafening. If this story is connecting dots you have not seen assembled anywhere else, you are already ahead of most people watching this unfold in real time. Hit subscribe right now. This situation is moving faster than any single outlet can track, and you need to be here when the next piece drops. Most governments, when facing a military superpower issuing deadlines and threatening civilian infrastructure, do one of two things. They capitulate immediately, or they scramble for a face-saving compromise that lets both sides claim partial credit. Iran did neither. Iran entered this confrontation with a single document, held it for weeks without revision, and waited. It did not issue a counteroffer to the U.S. 15-point plan. It did not soften its language. It used every mediator, every regional relationship, and every diplomatic backchannel to anchor its own framework as the only legitimate document in the room. And it worked. Iran built its position methodically. It communicated through Islamabad. It positioned Beijing and Moscow as pressure multipliers rather than passive observers. It prepared its narrative architecture so that the moment a ceasefire was announced, the official framing of who won was already written, already published as a formal government statement, and already in the hands of every major news organization before Washington had finished explaining itself. Not with missiles in the final hour, not with a last-minute military gambit, with a document, a network, and patience. Trump's approach was the architecture of blunt force, ultimatums with specific clocks, explicit threats against bridges, power plants, and civilian infrastructure, a vocabulary of absolute inevitability. But blunt force as a negotiating instrument only functions if the other side believes the threat is unconditional. After weeks of deadlines that bent and ultimatums suspended on request, Iran had accumulated enough receipts to demonstrate publicly that the force had a ceiling. Iran did not match Washington's military language. It made that language look like theater. You do not dismantle a threat by meeting it with equal aggression. You show the room that the threat has limits, and then you hand the other side a document to sign. So, what does this actually mean for you? If you work in shipping, energy, or global logistics, the Strait of Hormuz just became a coordinated toll corridor with Iran as the operational authority at minimum for the next 2 weeks, and potentially far longer depending on how negotiations in Islamabad proceed. The $2 million per ship fee is not symbolic. At the volume of traffic that moves through Hormuz daily, that is a structural revenue mechanism with cascading consequences every time a tanker passes. If you follow defense and security, the formal inclusion of a U.S. force withdrawal demand inside the active negotiating framework changes the diplomatic calculation for every Gulf state. Abitanda, Akatawatinki, Abat. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain are now all recalibrating what American security guarantees are worth when Washington accepted as, quote, workable basis a framework it previously called maximalist. Once a government begins restructuring its security architecture around new relationships, that restructuring does not reverse simply because the political temperature drops. The realignment follows the new routes, and it tends to stay. Israel's own officials acknowledge they received updates, according to Channel 12 Hotolbi, Tal 12 News, in the final moments when everything seemed finalized. That is not the language of partners who consult together. That is the language of a partner being notified after the decision is already made. That dynamic, once visible, does not disappear with the next positive phone call. Scenario 1, managed reset. Negotiations open Friday in Islamabad. Both sides carry economic and political incentives toward a structured agreement. Energy markets, Gulf business communities, and regional governments push hard for durability. Trump frames whatever emerges as a historic peace secured by his pressure campaign. Iran locks in meaningful sanctions relief, enrichment recognition, and reconstruction funding. The 10-point framework becomes the skeleton of a long-term agreement. The structural changes, including Iranian Hormuz Authority and expanded regional influence, remain regardless of how the final text is worded. The architecture is already built. Scenario 2, regional realignment accelerates. Other middle powers across the region and beyond draw an explicit lesson. A sustained, disciplined refusal to accept maximalist framing combined with a coherent alternative framework and patient diplomatic positioning can force a renegotiation even from apparent military inferiority. Countries that have been hedging their relationships toward Beijing and Moscow now have a live documented case study. Washington remains the largest military power on Earth, but the unquestioned axis around which the Middle East organized itself for decades has developed a publicly visible fracture. New networks once operational do not dissolve because one negotiation concludes. They become the new normal. Scenario 3, escalation and collapse. This is the scenario nobody wants to name out loud. The ceasefire is fragile by every observable measure. Within hours of its announcement, reports of ballistic missile activity and drone engagement were circulating from multiple directions simultaneously. Iran's Supreme Leader Moabbaham ordered his forces to halt operations while simultaneously stating, "This is not the end of the war." If hardliners on any side calculate that the 2 weeks represent cover for repositioning rather than genuine de-escalation, the Islamabad talks could collapse before producing a single agreed paragraph. The forces that wanted Iran removed from the strategic map have not disappeared. They have the means and the motivation to break a deal that leaves Iran standing, enriching, and framing itself as the victor. The relationship between Washington and Tehran will not return to where it was before the first strike. Even if this ceasefire collapses within the next 48 hours, the lesson has already been absorbed by every foreign ministry watching. American ultimatums have a visible price ceiling. Iran's negotiators demonstrated that. Pakistan demonstrated that it can operate as a consequential diplomatic architect. China and Russia demonstrated that they can shape off-ramps in spaces where Washington is reactive. That lesson does not expire with the next news cycle. Even if the leaders who made these decisions leave office tomorrow, the lesson has been learned. The blueprints do not vanish. They become the reference point for every negotiation that follows. Iran did not start this confrontation, but it appears to have been very precise about how it intended to frame the end point. Here are the questions that matter now. Did accepting Iran's 10-point framework as the basis for talks represent Trump's strategic flexibility? Or did maximum pressure collapse under the weight of its own rhetoric? Is this ceasefire the genuine foundation of a long-term regional settlement or a 2-week repositioning pause before the next escalation? And what do America's Gulf partners do next, knowing that the terms of their security architecture just shifted without their full consultation? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe because the next chapters, including the Islamabad negotiations, the Israeli response, and how Gulf states recalibrate their American security arrangements, are coming fast. This story is not slowing down. Do not look away. This content is commentary and analysis for informational purposes only. It does not constitute financial, legal, or geopolitical advice. Consult qualified experts before making decisions based on this analysis.